My father worshipped my brother his entire life while I was invisible. But when I inherited $1 million from my grandma, a letter revealed why he was never his real son, and my dad sued me to take it all away. I'm 27 years old. I work in digital marketing, and 6 months ago I inherited close to $1 million from my grandmother, which basically destroyed whatever relationship was left with my father and my brother. The thing is, my grandmother died in March and left a house in upstate New York worth like $600,000, plus another $250,000 in bank accounts and stocks. And I ended up with the part that was supposed to go to my father. Sounds simple when you put it like that. But the truth is, behind all this, there's like 30 years of family secrets, extreme favoritism, and a letter that changed everything I thought I knew about my family. I guess I should start from the beginning, when we were kids. Seth is 30 now, so 3 years older than me, and he was basically the perfect son his whole life. I'm not exaggerating, seriously. My father adored him in a way that even as a kid seemed weird to me. Seth could do whatever he wanted, and my dad would find a way to justify it or celebrate it. He got good grades. Dad would organize special dinners. He got bad grades. Dad would say the education system wasn't designed for creative minds like Seth's. I could get straight A's, and my father would barely say good job, but if Seth brought home a B, it was like he'd won a Nobel Prize. You know what I mean? It was that kind of favoritism so obvious that even the neighbors noticed it. We grew up in a relatively small town in upstate New York. Not the same one where my grandmother lived, but like an hour away. My mom was always kind of emotionally distant, like present but not really there, you know? She worked in an administrative office and would come home tired, so basically my dad was the one who dictated how the family worked. And in his world, Seth was the son, and I was like a minor planet orbiting around trying to get his attention. I remember once, I must have been like 12 years old. I won a state-level writing contest, and my dad didn't even go to the ceremony because that day Seth had a soccer game. A normal game. Regular season. Nothing special. But well, that's how things were. The interesting thing is, I never really knew my paternal grandparents well. My grandfather died when I was 5, I think, and I barely have vague memories of him. My grandmother, on the other hand, lived alone in that big house and would visit us from time to time, but the visits were always tense. Dad and her didn't get along well. That was obvious even to me as a kid. There was like a coldness between them, a kind of distance that wasn't just physical. She was polite, even kind. But when she talked to my dad, everything felt formal, almost like they were strangers forced to coexist. My aunts, Clara and Linda, my dad's sisters, did have a normal relationship with Grandma. I saw them more often, and they seemed to get along well. During high school and college, things didn't improve. Seth studied business. Administration and Dad supported him financially and everything, paid for his apartment near campus, new car when he turned 21, even got him a job at a friend's company when he graduated. I studied communications and had to work part-time throughout my whole degree because Dad said it was important that I learn the value of money and independence. I mean, basically, Seth received everything handed to him, and I had to prove I deserved anything. After graduating, I got a job in digital marketing in Albany, moved to a small but decent apartment, and honestly tried to build my life away from the family drama. I'd see my parents on Christmas, Thanksgiving, important birthdays, the basics. Seth lived like 20 minutes from them and saw them almost every weekend. My grandmother died in March of this year. She was 84 years old and apparently it was peaceful. She went to sleep and didn't wake up. The funeral was weird, very formal. Dad seemed more relieved than sad, which I thought was strange, but I didn't think much of it. My aunts were devastated, crying and sharing stories about Grandma that I didn't even know. I realized in that moment how little I had really known her, how much Dad had kept that relationship at a distance all these years. Like 2 weeks after the funeral, I got a call from Grandma's lawyer asking me to come to his office for the reading of the will. It surprised me because I thought that would only be for my aunts and my dad, but well, I went. It was a Tuesday afternoon, and the office was in the town where my grandmother lived. When I arrived, there were only my 2 aunts, the lawyer and me. Dad wasn't invited, which seemed really weird to me, but the lawyer explained that Grandma had been very specific about who should be present. The aunts didn't seem surprised by this, which made me think they knew something I didn't. The lawyer started reading the will, and basically Grandma had divided everything into 3 equal parts for her. 3 children, meaning Dad, Aunt Clara, and Aunt Linda. Each would receive a third of the house and the financial assets. Up to there, everything normal, right? But then the lawyer said something that left me frozen. He said that my father had been legally disinherited 20 years ago, but that my grandmother had left specific instructions that his part would go directly to me, Gavin, her grandson. Not to Seth. Not to divide between the two of us. Only to me. I sat there, unable to process what I had just heard. My aunts looked at me with a mixture of compassion and something else, like they knew exactly why this was happening. The lawyer continued, explaining that legally the inheritance was mine, that my father had no rights over it because the disinheritance was prior and legal, and that Grandma had been very clear in her instructions. I signed a bunch of papers, basically accepting the inheritance, and when everything was over, the lawyer handed me a sealed envelope. He said, Grandma had left instructions that only I could open it, that it was a personal letter for me. I left that office completely dazed. My aunt stopped me in the parking lot and Aunt Clara told me, "You're going to understand everything when you read that letter, and your grandmother wanted you to know she did the right thing." I didn't even know what to answer. I went home, like an hour drive, unable to think about anything else. When I got there, I poured myself a whiskey, which I don't even like whiskey that much, but I felt like I needed something. And I opened the envelope. My grandmother's letter was like 4 pages handwritten, and it basically destroyed everything I thought I knew about my family. It started by apologizing for not being more present in my life, explaining that my grandfather, her husband, had disinherited my dad when Seth was like 2 years old. The reason? Because Seth wasn't my dad's biological son. My mom was pregnant when she met my dad, and he decided to raise Seth as his own. But my grandfather considered this an unforgivable betrayal. According to the letter, my grandfather was very traditional, very strict with his ideas of family and blood, and when he found out the truth, he told my dad that if he raised another man's child as his own, he would no longer consider him his son. Grandma wrote that she didn't agree with my grandfather, but that back then, she didn't have much decision-making power, that the money and properties were in his name. After my grandfather died, she tried to rebuild the relationship with Dad, but he always rejected her, full of resentment for how his father had treated him. She explained that she had maintained limited contact with me and Seth because Dad didn't want us to be close to her, but that she had always watched me from afar. She said she had noticed how my dad favored Seth, how I was always the second choice, and that she understood why. Dad was overcompensating, trying to prove that Seth was his real son, that he deserved all his love and attention, probably as a rejection of my grandfather's attitude. The letter ended saying that I deserved something that was only mine, that I had worked hard for everything I had while Seth had received everything without effort, and that she hoped this money would give me the freedom to build the life I wanted, without feeling like I had to constantly compete for attention or validation. I sat there for like 2 hours on my couch after reading that, processing every word. Suddenly everything made sense, you know? The years of favoritism, Dad's obsession with Seth, the distance with Grandma, everything fit together in a horrible but perfectly logical way. I didn't tell anyone about the letter immediately. Like 3 days later, my dad called me. He had received a letter from the lawyer informing him that his mother had died, that he had been disinherited 20 years ago, and that his part of the inheritance had gone to me. He was furious, screaming on the tech, phone demanding explanations. Why I had accepted the money, why I hadn't rejected the inheritance, how I could do this to my family. I told him I needed time to process everything and hung up. He called me like 20 more times that day. I blocked him temporarily because I couldn't deal with that. During the next 2 weeks, Dad and Seth didn't stop contacting me. Text messages, emails, calls from numbers I didn't recognize. Seth said we needed to talk as a family, that this wasn't fair, that Grandma was clearly senile when she made the will. Dad was more direct, basically demanding that I divide the inheritance equally among the 3 of us, because that was the right thing to do. I didn't respond. I kept processing everything and honestly didn't know what to say. The truth is, part of me felt guilty, you know? Like for years, I had been trained to feel like I didn't deserve anything special, that I should always share everything with Seth or give him priority. But another part of me, a part that grew every day, was furious. Furious for all the years of being treated as second best. Furious because now that I finally had something that was only mine, they were demanding I share it. Furious because they weren't even asking how I felt or if I was okay. They just wanted the money. So basically I kept ignoring them. One Saturday, at like 10 in the morning, there was a knock on my door. I opened it and there were Dad and Seth, without warning, with very serious faces. Dad pushed the door, they came into my apartment, and Seth closed the door behind him. The situation immediately felt intimidating, like an ambush. Dad started saying that this had gone too far, that I was being selfish and destroying the family. Seth stood there with his arms crossed, backing up every word Dad said. I told them to sit down, that we needed to talk calmly, but Dad didn't want to calm down. He demanded to know why Grandma had done this, what I had said to manipulate her, if I knew this was going to happen. I swore I had no idea, that I had been as surprised as him, but he didn't believe me. Seth finally spoke and basically said the fair thing was to divide everything into 3 equal parts, that I would get a third, he'd get another third, and Dad the last third. That's what a decent person would do. And something in me broke in that moment. You know? All the frustration of years came out. I told them, let's talk about what's fair. I reminded them when Dad didn't even go to my awards ceremony because Seth had a game. I reminded them that Seth got a car and I had to buy mine used with my own money. I reminded them of all the times my achievements were minimized while everything Seth did was celebrated like a miracle. I told them that for 27 years I had been treated like I was less important, less valuable, less deserving of attention or love, and that now that I finally had something that was mine, they came demanding I share it. Dad turned red, said I was exaggerating, that he had never favored Seth, that he loved us both equally. Seth looked at me with a mixture of confusion and anger, like he genuinely didn't understand what I was talking about. And that was maybe the most frustrating thing, that Seth hadn't even realized how unequal everything had been because for him, that was normal. He had always been the favorite, so he didn't know anything else. I asked them to leave. Dad said he wasn't leaving until I signed something, committing to share the inheritance. I told him if he didn't leave, I'd call the police. We stood there staring at each other for like 5 minutes that felt eternal, until finally Seth put a hand on Dad's shoulder and told him they should go. They left, but Dad turned at the door and told me this wasn't over, that he wasn't going to let me destroy this family over money. That night, Dad came alone. He knocked on the door at like 11 at night. He looked tired, almost defeated. I let him in, and this time his attitude was different. He asked me to talk, to just sit down and talk like father and son. We sat in my small living room, and for the first time in my life, I felt like I had the power in our relationship. You know what I mean? He needed something from me and couldn't just demand it or ignore me until I gave in. He asked me directly what my grandmother had said in her will, why she had done this. And I decided enough with secrets. I took out my grandmother's letter, the 4 handwritten pages, and gave them to him. I told him to read that, and he'd understand everything. I watched his face change as he read, going from confusion to shock to something that looked like terror. When he finished, he sat there with the letter in his hands, trembling slightly. He looked at me and said, "She had no right to tell you this. This is none of your business." I answered that clearly it was my business if it affected my whole life, and explained why he had treated me the way he did all these years. I asked him directly if it was true, if Seth wasn't his biological son. He stayed quiet for a long while, and then nodded. He said yes. That my mom was 3 months pregnant when they met. That Seth's biological father had disappeared when he found out about the pregnancy, and that he had decided to raise Seth as his own because he loved my mom and wanted to give the baby a father. I asked him why he had never told me, why he had allowed me to grow up feeling inferior to Seth, and Dad basically broke down. He started crying, something I had never seen, saying that his father had rejected him for making that decision, that he had spent years trying to prove he was right in what he did, that Seth deserved all his love and more. He admitted he had probably gone overboard, that it hadn't been fair to me, but that back then he could only think about compensating Seth for not having his biological father, for giving him everything my grandfather had denied him as a father. I told him I understood why he had done it, but that didn't justify 27 years of making me feel like I didn't matter. That he had his reasons, but I had lived with the consequences. He asked for forgiveness, said we could work on our relationship, that please I shouldn't punish him for past mistakes by taking away the money. And there, I understood that in the end, it all came down to that for him, to the money. He wasn't really sorry for how he had treated me. He was desperate not to lose the inheritance. I told him to leave and not come back until he could talk to me without mentioning the money. He left, and that was the last real conversation we had. Like 2 weeks later, I received a letter from a lawyer. Dad and Seth were suing to invalidate the will, claiming that my grandmother wasn't in her right mind when she made it, that I had manipulated or influenced her, and that the will didn't reflect her true intentions. I hired a lawyer, obviously, and the whole legal process started. My aunts were incredible. They testified that Grandma was perfectly lucid, that she had made the will with a lawyer present and medical evaluations proving her mental competence, and that she had been very clear about her intentions. The process took like 3 months. There were hearings, statements, a bunch of papers, and stress. Dad and Seth kept insisting that Grandma had been manipulated or that she was resentful of Dad and had used the will as revenge. But Grandma's lawyer had done an impeccable job. Everything was perfectly documented. There was even a video recording of my grandmother explaining her decisions and confirming she was in full use of her faculties. In the end, the judge dismissed the lawsuit completely. He said the will was valid, that Grandma had every right to distribute her assets as she wanted, and that there was no evidence of manipulation or mental incompetence. My aunts received their parts without problem, and I officially received mine. The house sold for like $620,000, a bit more than estimated, and after taxes and legal costs, I was left with around $450,000. It's not $1 million, but it's enough to completely change my life. Seth showed up at my apartment like a week after the court made the final decision. He came alone this time and looked devastated. Not angry like before, but genuinely broken. He told me he needed to know the truth. That Dad had told him things, but he didn't believe him. That he needed to hear it from me. So I told him everything, showed him Grandma's letter, explained what Dad had confirmed to me. Watching his face as he processed that the man who raised him as his father wasn't his biological father was devastating. I'm not going to lie. He asked me if Mom knew, if everyone had known except him. I told him I had no idea what Mom knew exactly, but that clearly Dad and Grandma knew, and probably the aunts too. Seth sat there for like an hour on my couch without saying much, just processing. Eventually he left, thanked me for being honest with him, and that was it. I found out from my aunts that Seth moved out of my parents' house like 2 weeks after that conversation. He rented an apartment in another city, like 2 hours away, and basically cut off contact with Dad. He doesn't answer his calls, doesn't visit them, nothing. Mom apparently is devastated, but she hasn't tried to contact me either. I guess she knows there's not much to say. Dad has tried calling me a few times, but I don't answer, and eventually he stopped trying. I used part of the money to pay off all my debts, which weren't many, but it still felt good to be clean. I invested a good part, like $250,000, in diverse funds to ensure some long-term stability. And with the rest, I'm starting my own digital marketing consulting business. Something I always wanted to do but never had the initial capital. I hired 2 people. We're renting a small office, and we've been operating for like 2 months. It's going. Well, so far, we have 3 consistent clients and we're growing slowly. I'm not going to lie and say I'm completely okay with everything that happened. There are days I feel guilty, like I destroyed my family over money. But then I remember all the years of feeling invisible, of working twice as hard to get half the recognition Seth received, of watching Dad light up when Seth entered a room while barely noticing me. And then I realized I didn't destroy anything. The family was already broken. It's just that now the cracks are visible to everyone. Seth sent me a message like a month ago. It just said, "Thanks for telling me the truth. You probably saved me from living a lie for the rest of my life." I don't know if I should respond or what to say. Part of me wants to try to have some kind of relationship with him because at the end of the day we grew up together. We shared a childhood even if it was unequal. But another part feels like I need space, that I need to build my life without the shadow of that family dynamic. Last week, I went to visit my grandmother's grave. I brought flowers and stayed there for like half an hour talking to her, telling her about the business, about how I'm using the money. I thanked her for giving me a way out, for seeing what nobody else wanted to see all those years. I don't know if she can hear me or if there's anything after death, but it still felt important to say it out loud. I guess in the end, this isn't a story with a clean, happy ending where everyone reconciles and learns a valuable lesson. It's just the reality of a dysfunctional family where secrets and favoritism created damage that probably will never be completely repaired. I'm 27 years old. I have my own business, financial stability for the first time in my life, and a family I barely talk to anymore. I don't know if that counts as victory or loss. Maybe it's both things at the same time.